to a talk from the car. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm a veterinarian from Marietta, Georgia. And I'm taking this opportunity on my drive home from the office to talk to you briefly about food allergy and some of the changes that are in that right now. When I say changes, what I'm talking about is food allergy is nowhere near as common as they once thought it was. What they're talking about now is possibly what they call food adverse reactions. That is that the dog is not exactly allergic to milk or food. The dog is having an untoward response to it. Let me back up a second. I mentioned milk. When you're lactose intolerant, it doesn't mean that you're allergic to the milk. And when a dog has a problem with soy in its diet, it doesn't mean it's allergic to soy. So the University of Georgia has started using the term food adverse reactions, describing untoward problems with certain kinds of foods, certain kinds of ingredients in the diet. Now, I believe one of the most common food adverse reactions there are is to corn in the diet. Science has revealed that corn is not assimilated or digested quite as well as other sources of protein. But it goes beyond that. It goes to the fact that they have GMO'd, that means genetically modified, some kinds of corn to withstand the application of specific herbicides. Specifically, they can now spray the corn with Roundup. They've been spraying the soybeans with Roundup for quite some time, and I recall quite a few years ago in the late 80s, there was the general opinion that soybeans did not function very well in the diet of dogs. And I believe that's true, but I don't believe it's because of soybeans. I don't believe it's because of Roundup being sprayed on them. Well, corn started getting sprayed with Roundup recently, and to me it seems like the reactions to corn are on the rise. I don't recommend corn in a diet, although I don't consider it to be dangerous or hazardous or whatever. But I do believe that we're seeing a rise in food adverse reactions, not necessarily allergy to corn, but food adverse reactions in foods that are made with corn. And I attribute it to Roundup, but who knows? Another food adverse reaction comes from, in my opinion, things with chicken and beef. And I think the reason for that is because chicken and beef are loaded with drugs. I think it's funny the chicken industry right now is capitalizing on the fact that our chickens are hormone free, because that could very well be true. Growth hormone may be withdrawn, may not even be used anymore. But that doesn't mean that the chickens aren't loaded with drugs. Specifically, when a chicken is coming up, it's given antibiotics. It is also given medications to kill coccidia. Oh, and it's also sprayed with chemicals to keep it from getting poultry mites and other forms of lice, and dewormed. And it eats food that's based on corn and may have things like aflatoxins in them and other chemicals in the food. My point being is chicken is loaded with not just chicken. There's a lot of chemistry going on. Beef is very similar, whether there's hormones in the beef or not, besides what's already in the cow. There are dewormers, lousicides, other forms of insecticide, medications for fleas and ticks, ear tags, antibiotics, lots of chemicals. Now, those foods may be fed in the majority, which is why we see more reactions to those proteins and those corn-based diets. But I'm of the opinion that better sources of protein in the diet come from things like venison, rabbit, bison, duck, and fish. And you might say, just wait a second. Fish have mercury and other things in them, and I'd say, well, yes, to a certain extent they do. But for example, salmon used to be raised, and I think probably to a certain extent they still are raised in saltwater lagoons down in South America, Although I would say that's fallen largely out of favor because now they're raising salmon in huge, huge floating salmon pens in the North Sea. You can Google it up. So the salmon now, the majority of it, is being raised aquaculturally, but they're being raised in giant saltwater pens in what most would consider very clean water these days. So I would say salmon is a largely unmolested protein source. Duck and rabbit and bison, also relatively low intensity chemistry. Not as much dewormer, not as much leukocyte, not as much coccidiostat, not as much antibiotic. And I think those proteins are better for dogs. Now that's not turning around and saying that chicken and beef and corn are bad for dogs, because I'm pretty sure they're not. It's just, given a choice, I think I would rather have a protein and carbohydrate plant source that has not been doused in an herbicide, and I would rather have a meat source in my diet that is less chemical treated. So food allergy was at one time used as a blanket term for all forms of adverse reaction to the food. If a dog suddenly became itchy or had coat problems or developed seborrhea or digestive issues or inflammatory bowel disease or episcleritis or any of a number of other issues, it was all attributed to other things. It was attributed to food allergy. It was attributed to genetics and bad luck. And I'm not 100% sure that that's always the case. I think the chemistry of our food in dogs is a big factor in a lot of their health issues. So, I guess to recap, I'm saying food allergy isn't as common as food adverse reactions. And I think that when you're buying a dog food, you should be looking for a food that has protein that swims. Let's say ducks and salmon, and a vegetable that is hard to spray with chemicals. So let's leave soybean and corn out and go with something that's nearly impossible to spray with chemicals. How about a potato? So unless your dog's fat, you should consider possibly a salmon or duck and potato diet. If your dog's fat, that's too bad, because nobody has thought yet to make a salmon and potato diet that's low in calories. I don't know why not. Anyway, so that's just a little sermon on the concept of grain being so bad for dogs, when in actuality it's probably the chemicals on the grain, and chicken and beef being bad proteins for your dog, but that's probably because there's dewormers and leukocytes and coccidiostats and antibiotics in the chicken and the beef. So that's disconcerting, isn't it? Well, thanks for checking in. Appreciate you tuning in for this talk from the car, and I'll bring you other subjects, hopefully more interesting.